Hi, I'm Ben,
And I'm Josh.
and this is the Bad and Magic podcast, a podcast about games, life, and other things. So, we're back for episode 4, and we've got some leftovers from last time we need to clean up. The first of which was something I mentioned to you, Josh, which was a rip from the headline story that had happened in Boston, where a couple, I don't know, did you read this story?
I did. I stumbled across that story on Reddit, and most of the time when I see stories like that, I just read the headlines. But that one I actually dug into a little bit because it just blew my mind. Go ahead and explain it.
Okay, so I don't want to explain too much of the story because the reason I'm telling you this is because this actually happened to me. So the couple woke up one day and $120,000 had been deposited in their bank account. And I think, didn't they put a little bit of effort into trying to get the bank to correct the error and then just gave up and decided to spend the money?
I didn't read any of the actions that they took to try to clean it up, but the impression that the article gave is that they found $120,000, did a minimal effort to discover where it came from, and then immediately blew all of it.
Okay. All right. So, and we won't tell what happens to them. So I want to tell you what happened to me. So back in, it was like the year 2000, I was still in university. My wife, I sound like a British person. My wife and I
hang on a second. Where were you?
I was in university.
So you were in college for those of
Right.
you
I was
who
in
haven't
college,
been across the pond.
and my wife and I were pregnant with our second child, and I had some income, I had a job, and we were paying for two people's tuition and two babies, and we were squeaking by on student loans and my meager pay at my job doing tech support for Microsoft. And I think I maybe had like $500 that just wasn't committed to anything. And at the time, online trading accounts were really popular, like E-Trade and TD Online and stuff like that. And I opened up an online stock trading account, and I was putting that $500 into the stock market. It was kind of foolish.
Yeah, because of course, if you have $500 and you're on a shoestring budget, the most responsible thing that you can do with that money is immediately blow it in day trading.
Yes. So I had, just invested in a few stocks scattered here and there. And one day I woke up, logged into my account, and lo and behold, 500 shares of Office Depot that I had never seen before in my life. And at the time, I think Office Depot was worth $20 a share. So this was $10,000 deposited in my account. Now, I know $10,000 in the year 2000 doesn't adjust by inflation, $120,000. But it felt to me like $120,000. It was a lot of money.
Yeah, percentage-wise. And that's the thing about especially if you're on a lower income, like the percentage of the buying value of money is so much higher when money is tight than it is when you have disposable income. So, I mean, yeah, that must have felt like an amazing windfall.
So immediately what I tried to do is, like, I knew it wasn't my money and I knew I had to do something about it. So I had to find out where it came from and get it back there. So I just done a transfer from one bank to another, and I thought was related to that. It must have just been some error. So I called the bank that the transfer originated from. They denied knowledge in doing. I called the bank that the transfer terminated at. Same thing. And I did it again. I think I called them both 2 times, and everyone denied having anything to do with it.
So that seems really strange. Like a concerned citizen calling into the bank, like, "Hey, I think you accidentally gave me, what'd you say, $20,000?
$10,000.
Yeah, $10,000." And that just shows you how the responsibility just completely evaporates from the employees at a big corporation. Like, nobody feels any responsibility for any amount
the
of
person
money.
answering the phone doesn't care about the bank losing $10,000.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine what freaking, like, any bank's error and omission insurance has to be, but I mean, that's well within their monthly limit.
So, I had my job, I had my friends, I had all my classmates. I had this kind of big casual social circle, but before the days of Facebook. And so I kind of did real life Facebook. I'm like, hey, everyone I met, I'd be like, what would you do if you woke up and you had $10,000 that you didn't have the day before? And I'd kind of give them a quick version of the story. And I got to tell you, Josh, I was astonished because first of all, I was going to a Mormon university, and second of all, most of the people I went to that were in my social circle were members of my church, and I was astonished at how like amoral the response I got was. What do you think the most common answer people gave me was when I asked them the question?
Well, before I answer that question, I want to point out that the way that you phrased the question might have affected the answer. Because if you asked me, what would you do with $20,000 you didn't have yesterday? Like, the question assumes that you came across the money in some legitimate way. That it's not, that you didn't
I made it very
Now,
clear when I was telling people about this that I did not get the money legitimately.
Okay, so they knew that, like, their hypothetical $20,000 they're supposed to spend in this scenario was ill-gotten gains.
10,000, yes, but also with the caveat that I tried to give it back and no one would take it. Like if you found $10,000 and you took it to the police station and they refused to take it.
Yeah, that's weird. But so to answer your original question, asking a bunch of people that are profoundly moral citizens if they had $10,000, what would they do with it? I'm going to say the most popular answer was buy a car because you were in college.
Yeah, there were various versions of that. Mostly people were just like, oh man, spend it. Hurry before somebody figures it out and takes it back, which to me is idiotic. So Robert and Tiffany Williams from Pennsylvania spent this $120,000 like it was going out of style. And of course, when the bank came looking for the money, it was all gone. And what, did they go to jail? I forget what happened to them.
So the version I heard is they did spend a lot of it paying off debt, and they gave a bunch away to friends and family that also had debt. But then they spent like the remainder of it in very short order. And the last that I read in the article is they were being charged with grand larceny or something.
Yeah,
like they were trying to
now
pin the
face
crime on
3
them.
felony charges of theft and receiving stolen property.
Yeah, so the receiving stolen property is probably the one that's going to stick because, like, how do you defend against that? But the theft, I mean, you can argue, is that really theft? Like, I showed up, there was money there, and I asked some questions, but not very hard. Is that really theft?
Right, but, as much as a minimum wage person answering the phone at the bank can't figure out how to help you with your problem, police officers have no trouble finding places in the law to throw the book at you, and that's what's happening here. So back to my case in 2000, starving student in college, there was no way on earth I was going to touch that money. Like, no way. Even though without exception, every person I talked to told me that I should spend the money or move it or do something. I was like, no, I'm not touching that money. I think it was exactly 2 weeks to the day, and I called the bank another couple of times, and they denied it all doing. 2 weeks to the day. One day, it mysteriously disappeared from my account, like it had never been there in the first place.
Now, that's weird that they have the ability to reach into your account and pull money back. I'm guessing maybe they reversed the transaction and it took the trading company a while to catch up to that. That's the only
I'm sure there was someone out there who the stock belonged to that was like, wait a minute, where did my 500 shares Office Depot go? And then all of a sudden, poof, it disappeared out of my account.
That must have been it. Like, it might have been completely internal to the trading company and might have had nothing to do with the banks. Now, here's a question for you. Do you think those upstanding moral citizens that you talk to would have answered differently if the anonymity of the internet hasn't been involved? Like, it's really easy to pretend that, like, oh, this money just appeared as numbers on a screen in my account. This is clearly mine. Now, if you phrase the question, if you found, like, a wallet on the side of the road that had like a guy's ID in it, and it had 10,000 cash in it, would you take the cash or would you give it back?
You're right. There was something about the kind of particulars of my dilemma that isolated people from their morality.
And that's that insulation that you get being removed.
It wasn't my money, and it belonged to someone. I mean, maybe there's like, it's this invisible money because of the internet, like you said. But I don't think that's the case. I don't know, because I don't think those same people, if they'd been in my situation, would have done what they were giving me the advice to do. And that was the part that baffled me. Why were they giving me that advice? It didn't feel. Well, I don't know.
It's the internet and being separated from actual feelings of real consequences. Like, you're totally insulated from the person-to-person connection. So I imagine if they had found the money on the side of the street in cash, they'd have responded very differently than just the digital, the electrons showing up on their computer one day.
Yeah. And that was back in the year 2000. Made me think of that Conan O'Brien sketch.
I mean, I'm thinking back to the year 2000. What $10,000 could have bought? I mean, goodness gracious, Ben, you could have been an oil tycoon by now.
I just need to buy some Yahoo stock. So the other leftover I'd had from last time is I'd gone back and I was listening to our shows. There's something you'd said that I mostly let you get away with, but I think it's time to take issue with. And that's the fact that you seem to live in this place where in your mind you think of yourself as both the kind of person that's the life of the party and a self-confessed introvert. And I wanted to ask you how those two things coexist in your mind.
Poorly is the correct answer. So I know what you mean, and I did go back and listen to the podcast and pick that out as well. It's like, wait, this guy always saying he's some lonely loser? Oh, wait, that guy's me. No, but I am a self-professed introvert. And I define introversion as if you're in a social setting, whether your batteries are being recharged or whether you're having to expel energy to interact with other human beings in a social setting.
That's interesting. So to you, these are non-overlapping characteristics. They're not just contradictory terms.
No, they're... just because any introvert can tell you, like, just because they're introverted doesn't mean they can't be sociable. It doesn't mean they can't carry on a conversation or do small talk. The difference is that it's draining. It takes emotional effort to be vested in a conversation with people, especially with people you don't know. If it's like very close friends or a small group, then that can be relaxing. But I can always think to like birthday parties or any kind of large social setting where there's people I don't know, and it's very taxing to try to be upbeat and outgoing. So, yeah, I don't know how to really describe it any differently than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that insight. I feel like I learned something new. I don't. You also called me an extrovert, and I don't know if I would categorize myself that way.
So I call you an extrovert because, like, the last time we were together at the tournament in Vegas, you would walk up to random people that you had never met before and strike up a conversation with them. And that's not something that I would do outside of a structured, like, unless, like, as part of the tournament, I had to sit down across from this person and play a game with them. That's the only time I'm going to start to interact with other people willingly. I'm not going to just talk to some random bystander.
I feel like I've changed over time related to that. I was reflecting on the fact that I don't strike up conversations with the person next to me on the airplane anymore, where I used to do that in the past.
Okay, just the fact that you're willing to talk to anybody on an airplane is a strong indicator that you are an extroverted person, because I don't think I have ever talked to anybody besides a flight attendant on an airplane.
It's so contextual. I mean, I was a full-time missionary for 2 years. Whether I liked it or not, it was my job to talk to like every single person I saw.
Whew. And you're that was a hard sell too for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do that job.
Yeah, and my son's doing it now. All right. I want to rename our recurring segment that I was calling the British Word of the Day. In honor of the name of our podcast, I want to call it Bad at English. So
we are bad at a lot of things, so saying bad at English just makes sense.
Yeah. So for Bad at English today, I picked a phrase that I picked up on in meetings in the United Kingdom. So I worked at the Information Systems and Services headquarters for the Ministry of Defense, where it was the equivalent of our like DODIN or DISA, where they would plan out all of their computer networks and SATCOM networks and all those kinds of things. And I sat in a lot of meetings where there was a lot of prioritization decisions going on, where there was limited money or people or that kind of thing. And whenever they would have a prioritization discussion, invariably someone would use a form of this phrase: crocodile nearest the canoe. So that's going to be our phrase today. And I picked that because it relates to the book we're going to talk about later on. But crocodile nearest the canoe is a British way of saying something we say in America probably would say the crocodile closest to the canoe. And the idea is that when you're trying to survive, there may be a lot of dangers in the jungle, but the thing you need to worry about is the biggest danger that's the closest to you. And that would be usually their justification for ignoring long-term planning. You're like, well,
yes,
we can't put any money towards that. We need to worry about the crocodile nearest the canoe.
Yes, because immediate results are more important than long-term ramifications, especially for my promotion, since I'm leaving here in 6 months.
Right. Well, this ISS headquarters was mostly civilians. I was frequently the only military person in the room, so that wasn't the explanation. But Crocodile nearest the canoe does come from a scarcity mindset. So we'll get that later on when we talk about the book. So try to use...
Stay riveted, dear listeners.
So try to use a form of Crocodile nearest the canoe in a sentence today. For new topics, so if we're going to keep calling ourselves bad at magic, I figure we need to talk about magic every now and then. But there is something that I want to talk about that I thought could have broad appeal to all of our listeners. So a while back, one of the head designers for Magic, named Mark Rosewater, he published an article where he talked about how because Magic is such a broad game and so many people play it, that they don't got to please everyone all the time, but they need to please at least somebody every time. And he talked about understanding their customers in terms of player psychographics. And he defined what later became an expanded definition of a small group of kind of caricatures of people that certain aspects of the game appealed to. So as there's a new...
But
go ahead.
When you're referring to this, like the player psychographics, he's referring to like broad generalizations of the type of people that choose to play Magic and what portion of the game appeals to them the most.
Exactly. So the main ones he came out with when he started this idea were three different types: Timmy, power gamer; Johnny, combo player; and Spike. I don't think he had a suffix to his name. But the ideas were that there was someone who played the game because it was exciting and did cool things. There was somebody who played the game because they were able to express themselves and come up with new ideas. And there was somebody who played the game because they like to win and be victorious.
That is correct. And so you can evolve as a player as you go through this. I think every Magic player starts out as Timmy. They just want to cast the biggest cards and like the biggest effects and just like, wow, look how big this is. And then the guy sitting across from them who's evolved into the Johnny just goes, uh-huh, and then immediately wipes the floor with him.
Yes. Now there's another psychographic he later added called Vorthos, and Vorthos likes the flavor of the set or the story behind it or the art on the cards. And so as this new... Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to point out that a lot of people may not realize that they do have flavor and a story. So every set that comes out, there's usually a book that accompanies the set that explains like the main characters and like kind of the general story that's happening. The cards themselves have art that depicts what the effect of the card is, and they have little italicized text at the bottom that do nothing for the game, but just add a little bit of flavor to what the card is trying to do. And that's the stuff that kind of appeals to Vorthos.
And so every set has an overarching story that they're telling, which brings us to the newest set, which is called Throne of Eldraine. And this is a top-down design where they decided they wanted their theme to be fairy tales. So they designed a world where all the cards and characters and players in it kind of have this attachment to myths and legends and stories and fairy tales that you're familiar with. Now, I went to the pre-release last weekend, and I brought my 9-year-old daughter Samantha with me, and we both played Sealed, where you just open up a bunch of random packs and open them up. And she immediately connected with this set on a Vorthos level. Like, she was very much excited by the cards that reminded her of the fairy tales she knew. She was like, "Oh, Daddy, this one's the Three Little Pigs." Or, "Oh, Daddy, this one's Cinderella." And, "Oh, Daddy, this one's Snow White." And she was just so excited about all the connections to things that she knew.
That's really cool. And to be fair, like, this set is very, very flavorful. Like, I also, I'm a Johnny Vorthos, and like, I really appreciate, they did a really good job with a lot of this set. Like these cards just embody the fairy tale that they're supposed to be, and it's just great.
So here's the tension you and I have been having, because whenever you get back into Magic and a new set comes out, it captures your inner Johnny Vorthos, and you're like, "Oh, how cool is this? How about this combo? We could build this deck." And I can't engage on that because my inner Spike's like, "All right, I don't have enough money to buy all these cards, so I'm waiting for the best decks to come out so that I can just focus on that and beat people." So
yeah, and just to try to. Sorry, just to elaborate a little bit for the listener. So Ben is categorizing me, and I'm categorizing myself as Johnny Vorthos. So the Johnny is I want to express myself in some creative way, and the Vorthos is I'm very much into the story and like the flavor and everything that's going on with the set. And Ben is 100% pure Spike. Like, he doesn't care what the cards look like. Like, he would play with blank cards that just had the words on them. He just wants to win. He just wants to beat his opponent into submission. He doesn't care what color the cards are. He just wants to win.
I'd say I'm probably like 90% Spike, 8% Johnny, and 2% Timmy. Because I do like to put in cards that no one else did into an archetype, but not too many, like 5 or less, and try to do something cool. Because I'd be interested in being recognized for doing something innovative, but I also don't feel like I know enough to take a lot of risk in that area.
And that's funny because when we were gearing up for the latest tournament that we went to in Las Vegas, I'd been out of the game for years. And so I'd spent some time reading up on the current state of the game. And like, I remember texting you all the time of like, oh, this is awesome. And like, I'd like see a card and like come up with a little combo or want to discuss like the different interactions. And most of the time you just didn't even respond to the text message.
Yeah,
like,
I was just having a hard time engaging with that.
By a hard time engaging, you mean like you look at your phone and just put it back down and just ignore it until I got
was
back
I
to you
ghosting
with
you?
something relevant. Sometimes I would send you a message a little bit later to follow up just to see if you were ghosting me, and then you would respond to that one. I'm like, oh, okay, so you just don't care about the cards. No, that's fine.
So one thing that's kept me involved with Magic has nothing to do with Johnny, Timmy, Spike, Vorthos, is that it's become a family activity that we do together. My kids don't play Little League Baseball, but we do play Magic. And so we always go to Friday Night Magic, and lately it's been like me and 3 of the kids will go. And so we'll go play Constructed. It's just the cheapest long-term way to play, where we'll bring a deck with us that we built in advance. But I like to make sure the kids at least have a competitive deck so they don't just go and get beat every time. So I basically have to acquire enough cards in the current standard format in order to have 4 competitive decks. So I have a few rules about this. One is that when you have to have 4 competitive decks, I can't the expensive parts of the deck is usually what? What's the most expensive part of a deck?
Well, I mean, our listeners don't care about this, but it's always going to be the land or the mana base.
Exactly. So what does that mean for my deck construction requirements for 4 kids?
So if you have for people that don't understand, the game at its heart is a resource management game, and so there's 5 different colors that you have to manage, and most people will only play 1 or 2. You can go 3. But the resources in the game are the lands. And so the more complicated or more complex or the more colors you're playing, the more expensive the cards are to make that work. So if you had to build 4 mutually exclusive decks, then you're looking at probably 1 color, maybe 2.
You nailed it. You're exactly right. You got right to the heart of the problem, and that is when I'm building 4 competitive decks, I can't have them be overlapping colors. So usually, they're 1 or 2 colors, and they don't share mana bases. And then I can build 4 pretty good decks, and we can go and play every week. Well, this month marks the rotation of the standard format, and a whole bunch of cards that were current have rotated out, and so it just completely turns my collection upside down. I got to get all my cards out and sort through them and put all the ones that have now rotated out of the standard format, and then come up with 4 new competitive decks. And I can't say I'm looking forward to it. Sometimes I do. I'm like looking forward to the refreshing, and this time I'm just not.
This is actually very enlightening because when we go to tournaments, you and I, it's just you. And so you have like these really tuned, very tight decks that run very, very well, and that you've played into the ground and you know them inside and out. And that makes sense that you would be a hardcore Spike when you're playing by yourself at a tournament, because when you're at home with your kids, you're forced into this Johnny role where you have a very limited card pool, and you've got to come up with not 1, but 4 mutually exclusive, non-overlapping competitive decks. That's got to be a real pain.
Yeah, and as we've said in the past, restrictions breed creativity. So yeah, it does kind of skew me in a different area. All right, well we do need to move on, but what you should do is you should make 3 good competitive decks and then 1 just terrible one, and then everybody has to play a little mini game before the tournament to see who has to get stuck with the crappy deck. Play rock, paper, scissors. Okay, so you'd written down a question you wanted to ask me that I didn't quite know what it was.
Okay. Yes, so going through the show notes, one of the things that you mentioned on the last episode when you were talking about how your daughter got run over by a car. How is she doing, by the way?
She's great. Doesn't even have the brace on her leg anymore. She's got new problems.
She had a brace on her leg for a while, though.
It was more for her psychological well-being than physical well-being.
Did one of the mothers of the internet group snap a picture of her and they print it all on signs and stuff like, "We need crossing guards, save this little girl"?
No idea. We didn't engage on that.
Something else we should talk about someday. But no, during that conversation, you had mentioned that your son, your 13-year-old son, walking your daughter to school, had his cell phone with him. And, like, it didn't occur to me until I was listening back to the podcast, like, wait a minute, he's got a 13-year-old kid that has a cell phone. He's got a lot of kids. Like, how many phones have your children had through your time as a parent? Which then opens up a much larger conversation of how did you control their consumption of digital media, like their access to unrestricted awfulness of humanity that we call the internet?
So I'm going to kind of answer this question by asking you some questions, because in your bafflement, I think there's a little bit of an assumption about what you thought I would do. So what did you think my policy would be about this kind of thing, as far as like giving my kids a phone or letting them have access to the internet?
So part of me would think you're a very technical guy. Like, you're very up on technology and you know how that stuff works. So part of my brain wants to think that you gave your kids like a normal smartphone or whatever the baseline smartphone is that came off of the shelf with the plan, and then tweaked it or installed some parental controls or guidance or administrative control over it to restrict their access to things. But then another part of my brain remembers that you didn't even have a smartphone until like 2 years ago. So then it's possible that you just gave your kids the old Nokia bricks for next to nothing, and it's for voice and really bad text messaging only. Those would be the two solutions I think you would come up with in this scenario.
So you highlighted all of the relevant details, and the truth is like halfway in between. Basically, when I got here to the States, I got here like 2 months before my family, and I kind of had some time to get ready. I'm like, all right, I'm going to make the smartphone plunge. I'm going to do the same with my kids. So when I went down to the store and got my phone, I got a family plan and 4 phones, one for my wife and 3 for the 3 oldest kids. And I got like cheap, old, reconditioned like iPhone 5S's that, like 4 generations old or something like that, which are still,
okay,
modern smartphones with a lot of capabilities, but not the latest and greatest. Just a beater that I could give to the kids that cost like $100 each, so that if they dropped them and cracked them, which they invariably did, because my family slogan is "That's why we can't have nice things." Yeah. So now, as far as your assessment of me being technical, that's true. Although, in my attempts to find an elegant solution that doesn't require constant management and is poorly executed, I've come up completely empty-handed. Like, I've tried like 5 different solutions and nothing is satisfying. It's either too complicated and requires too much overhead, or it doesn't work very well and it has lots of false negatives and it's problematic. And ultimately, my solution goes back to my parenting theory, which is that ultimately I want them to get to level 3 where they understand the purpose and they're empowered to make the decisions themselves. So mostly I kind of live on a monitor and occasionally check and just keep an eye on them kind of system, rather than this heavy-handed, technologically enabled, God looking into their every move kind of approach.
I do understand what you're saying. And the reason I'm so interested in the topic is because my son is going to turn 8 this weekend. And he's already got friends at school that have phones. I don't know if they're smartphones or what, but I mean, just the fact that he's in 2nd grade and he's already seeing phones at school and asking me if he can have his own phone, that's scary to me, because like you said, you want your kid to get to level 3 where you can trust them and they can handle what the world's going to throw at him. But my son is going to be 8. He has absolutely no idea of what exists out there, and I don't want him to find out on his own, like, just yet.
So, sorry, did you say you're getting him a cell phone then?
No. I'm definitely not getting a cell phone.
So what do you think's the right age?
Not yet. I think middle school. I don't know. Whenever the kid is, I think when I am comfortable with him, like, leaving the house to go do stuff, like if he says, hey, I'm going to go ride my bike to a friend's house, or I'm going to go down to the corner store and get, Nerds or something from Walgreens, like I used to do as a kid. I think once I'm at the stage where I can trust him to go travel short distances on his own out of my line of sight, that's probably when I'm going to want him to have a cell phone.
Yeah.
So that's probably somewhere in middle school, I think.
So in my story, you remember my 13-year-old daughter, my 13-year-old son had a phone and my 11-year-old daughter didn't. And that's the dividing line somewhere in between there, basically, for our family. That's somewhere in between the ages of 11 and 13 is when they're ready and they need it.
Okay. And that's about the age I was expecting. But I imagine at first I'm going to want to have strict controls over, what he has access to. Just not in a way that I think he's going to misuse it, but in a way that he's just not prepared for the kind of just human sewage that exists in the world. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's stuff out there that is looking to victimize children, and they're not prepared. My wife and I talked about this as we were talking about the stranger danger thing, and we were giving the kids a stranger danger talk. I don't know why we give that talk to kids. If there's a determined grown-up that wants to take advantage of a kid, what power does the kid have?
None whatsoever. Right. But you have to have the talk, because if not, there's nothing that confuses and shuts down a kid more than unexpected circumstances. If a kid doesn't know what to do, then most likely they're going to do nothing. If they've at least been introduced to the concept that this is a possibility that could happen, maybe there's a tiny chance that they'll execute the simplest instruction that you give them.
Or you give them the feeling that it's okay to come talk to you about it, and you can help them understand what happened and deal with the aftermath of whatever nonsense there was.
Yeah, I think we're thinking of two different scenarios. But I gave my kids a talk when we were first at Legoland before we left the hotel.
Oh, you're talking about stranger danger. I was talking about bad stuff on the internet.
Well, okay, so two stories for that one. One, stranger danger thing. We told the kids, hey, there's going to be a lot of people, so you need to stay in our line of sight. And if somebody takes you, what are you going to do? And they looked at us blank. I go, you just start screaming. Start screaming as loud as you can, and I will come beat them up. And they thought that was funny. But that is funny, but that is exactly what's going to happen. So do that.
Yeah.
The other end of that, the internet danger. My son plays Minecraft on the Switch with my wife a lot, and he always asks, I heard that you can hook this up to the internet and you can play with other people in there. And I just go, no. Why not, though? That'd be cool to have other people. I'm like, it would be cool to have other people.
Did you let him watch Endgame with you? Because I think there's that great scene where they're at Thor's house in New Asgard. This guy's talking about me mom again. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not a conversation I want to have with him. I try to explain to him, there are some people that'll lie and that'll try to get information from you. And he didn't really, you could tell, he's 7, he didn't really get it.
Yeah.
But so we just tell him, no, that's not going to be a thing. Yeah.
So I have a funny story about that. When Michael was young, and we were going through this for the first time with him, he was, 4 years old, and we sat him down and gave him the stranger danger talk, and we were doing little script dialogues where we would tell him what response he was supposed to say and then have him parrot it back. And we're like, okay, so if a stranger comes to you and wants you to get in the car with them, what do you say? And he said, no. And we were like, right. And we said, and if a stranger comes to you and wants to give you some candy, what do you say? And he said, please? Well, he's picking up these lessons. You just kind of got a little out of context there. So
that reminds me, you don't watch South Park, but there's an episode where one of the characters, one of the little kids, is just playing on the side of the road, and some celebrity in a limo pulls up and it's like, hey kid, get in the car. And he goes, I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to get in the car with strangers, my parents said so. And the celebrity goes, well, did your parents say anything about limousines? And the kid has that little thought bubble appear with his parents and goes, Butters, never get into a car with a stranger. Unless it's a limousine. and then the kid just goes
right ahead.
Yeah, and then he shrugs and goes, oh yeah, they did. And then he gets in the car and they drive off.
Okay, I know how South Park is. Was it Michael Jackson in the limousine?
No, it was Paris Hilton.
Okay. What did she want with the kid in the limousine?
We're definitely not going to go into that.
Okay. All right. Well, speaking of people in limousines, I want to tell you about my trip to Chicago last week.
That was a high-speed, excellent transition. Go on.
Awesome. So 3 months ago, Avril Lavigne came back from the dead. I didn't even know what had happened to her, but it had been 5 years since people heard hide or hair of her, and she had apparently contracted Lyme disease and had been on her deathbed for 2 years. She stopped producing music, she stopped touring, and was really just fighting for her life. And she wrote a new song called Head Above Water, where she sings about fighting for life, and went back to a recording studio and released a new album. And along with the new album, Head Above Above Water, she went on tour. And I kind of felt like this as I did about like when Michael Jordan like came out of retirement for the 4th time or whatever it was. And I was like, okay, I'll go see him. And I went and saw him play for the Washington Wizards or something against the Utah Jazz. I was like, okay, I guess it was cool to see Michael Jordan, but I felt like I missed him. You know, like he was past his prime. So I was a little bit worried, a little bit apprehensive that going to see Avril Lavigne in concert was going to be like that. But anyway, I bought some tickets. It was like 3 months out, and I bought 2 tickets to go see her in Chicago because that's like a 5-hour drive from my house here in St. Louis. And I was like, okay, I'll go see Avril Lavigne. And my wife didn't want to go, and it was kind of hard to figure out how to do it with the kids and stuff because it was on a Thursday night. So my sister lives up near Chicago, my next younger sister than me. And so she agreed to go with me, and that was the plan. So I took 2 days off of work. I got up early and went up that day, and she is, even though she's just a little bit younger than me, she never finished college for various reasons, and she's getting her bachelor's in computer science right now. And she was at Northern Illinois University, which is where I met Alicia, my wife, and like I do when I want to learn about something new, I'd never been to the class at this university, and I hadn't seen much about it, so I went to class with her.
Of course you did. So, of course you went to a random computer science class.
Yeah, so one was the systems engineering class and one was the Java class. And I was like, okay, cool. I get to see all this stuff I missed out on because this wasn't my degree, and see what my sister's learning and stuff like that.
No, you don't want to go to those classes.
Oh my gosh, coming in the middle of a semester in a systems engineering and Java class, it was aggressively dull. And it makes...
Okay. Tread lightly here. I do have my undergrad.
Oh my gosh, Josh, it was so boring. So
that's how I felt.
Anyway, I love spending time with my sister. I adore her, and it was great. And we went back and got ready and went into Chicago for the concert. So hang
on. I want to bring something up. You do the best crap sandwiches like ever. So for any listener that's not aware, like that's a term that we used to use in the Air Force where whenever you're talking to somebody, you have to start with something good, and then you say a bad thing, and then you end with something good. And I don't know, it's just so natural for you to just always cap off. Whenever you say something negative, it feels like there's a part of your brain that kicks in. Okay, I have to say something really, really nice about this person now.
You just described every email I wrote today. Okay, so this weird thing happened that really changed the whole circumstance. So I was going to go and spend like 2 nights at my sister's house, and we'd just hang out. And she has 4 kids, and I love them. And I was just going to hang out with her family for a couple of days. Well, basically, like the day of, when I was on my way up to her house, a friend at work who is a lieutenant in the Navy, who almost became like a concert French hornist, had called and says, hey, do you and your wife want to go with us to the Symphony in St. Louis? I came into 4 tickets. Somebody gave them to me, and it's on Saturday night. I was like, I was going to be back Saturday night, so we'll go. Get a babysitter. We'll go out to dinner. We'll go to the Symphony in St. Louis. Well, on my way up to Chicago, he calls me, or I get a text from him, and he's like, hey, did I say Saturday night? I meant Friday night. I was like, oh, crap. So I did this.
Well, that's different. Those are different days.
Yes, different days. So it was consecutive nights, one in Chicago, one in St. Louis. They're 300 miles apart. So I was like, I did this evaluation in my head, and I'm sure it's an evaluation we all do, where I decide, I could probably make this happen if I try real hard, but I'm going to have to invest a whole lot of capital in this relationship. Do I want to? And for this person, the answer was yes. Like, I really like this guy. I'm interested in, investing in the relationship, and I wanted to go see the Symphony. So I'm like, okay, I'll do it. So I rearranged my plans, and I told my sister I kind of had to blow off my nephew for some plans we made. I'll make it up to him later. And it ended up basically that for Avril Lavigne's concert tour, she decided that she wanted to hold them, or probably her managers decided they wanted to hold it in smaller venues. So the Avril Lavigne Head Above Water tour was held in the Chicago Theater. And the following night, I went to the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra in Powell Hall in St. Louis, which was almost identical venues, which was really fascinating to go on consecutive nights to identical venues. So these 2 theaters, the Chicago Theater and Powell Hall, were both built in the 1920s. They both kind of had like neo-Baroque, late Gothic kind of architectures. They were very much designed in the era before like amplified sound, and so they were designed to have good acoustics all the way to the back. They both have a capacity of roughly 4,000 people. They're both on the National Historic Places Register, and they're both kind of in the heart of the cultural district of their respective cities.
I'm more interested in when and why you conducted this research.
I don't want to talk about that.
Here's the thing. Like, everything that you're saying makes sense. Like, yeah, they were like big venues built around in the same era, so it makes sense that they would be roughly similar. They're in the same
Roaring
geographic
20s.
location. Yeah, the Roaring 20s. But I mean, imagine, like, they're only 300 miles apart. How many like grand venue architects existed back at that time? So I mean, it's not outside the realm of possibility that like the same firm was hired to design both of these buildings, possibly.
But that wasn't actually the case. But this is the era when America, was like booming, and it was the Roaring 20s, and everyone, they were building theaters to have cultural things. I bet these places were cold and dark during the recession and the war, but they were either restored or retained, and now they're pretty beautiful venues to go to.
I'm sure they were converted into like soup kitchens or munitions factories or something,
right,
in the decades that followed. But again,
you had sad concerts where only rich people went and pretended like everything was normal, even though it wasn't.
That's a thing. Also, you could have had the people that were pretending to be rich to keep up appearances who were actually pawning all their furniture showing up there. So you hang on. I can't do it. You and I can have an educated discussion about the cultural era and these two structures. I have to have my original question answered. When and why did you conduct this research?
Okay, so I didn't plan this. Like none of this was planned. It all just happened by accident on the day I was headed to the Avril Lavigne concert. I ended up having these two things, but it was after I came out of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra concert that I was really kind of pondering on the singularity of what I'd just done. Like, of the 4,000 people in those two arenas, do you think any of them went to both of those concerts?
I mean, yeah. I mean, if you're looking at the bell curve of possibility, it's probably on the lower end of that.
Yeah, I'm a big outlier here. So, the Avril Lavigne concert was obviously a rock concert. I mean, she's been a top-tier pop star for 17 years. She has 6 albums. She played like two hit songs from each of her previous 5 albums and like 4 songs from the most recent album. It was a fantastic concert.
Did you take notes during this concert? You are incredibly well informed about Avril Lavigne.
So I found this fantastic website I'll put in the show notes where basically people that go to concerts go and like write down the set list after a concert, and then it like aggregates them and makes pie charts and graphs and stuff. Oh man, this website is awesome.
So I've got my head in my hands. This is blowing my mind. Like, you went to a pop concert and then you were fascinated by like the pie chart breakdown of the track selection.
Well, here's the thing. I thought I knew who Avril Lavigne was, and I sang along to every song, but she played one song that I'd never even heard it before, and everyone was singing along. I'm like, what happened? How does she have a song I've never even heard before? So I was like, well, after the concert, I was like, well, they don't give you a set list when you attend the concert. So like, how do I know what songs she played? Because I don't even remember the name of it. So I went to see if there was a website, and I found this cool website called setlist.fm. It's called the Setlist Wiki. And basically people just go and say, here's the songs I heard when I went to the concert, and here's what they played for the encore. And then it just keeps like this aggregate, not just for that artist, but for like all artists. Like, this song's been played in concert 765 times, 30% of which were covers by other bands. I mean, it's way cool.
I'm imagining you in a darkened room late at night with a big pot of coffee and like multiple monitors open on separate computers, with like one tab looking at the Avril Lavigne pie chart breakdown, another one researching the architecture firm from the St. Louis Powell Hall Theater, and like another one like linking like how many people attended both. Like, I'm just seeing this Charlie Day meme where you're like have all this yarn attached.
You nailed it. Exactly. I was sitting there with multiple monitors in the dark looking at all these charts and graphs. So the Avril Lavigne concert was great. She rocked. Everyone loved it. We sang along, had a great experience. My sister and I had a great time in Chicago. She sang all her favorites and some new ones that aren't so great, but hopefully maybe she'll bounce back and start to have a second wind in her career. I guess you could argue on the number of wins she's had.
We can also discuss the fact that the Head Above Water tour sounds suspiciously like I Ran Out of Money tour. And
Yeah.
we wanted it to be smaller venues, so
Yes.
it feels more cush. It's like, are you sure you just couldn't sell out the larger venues?
You nailed it. My sister and I talked about that. Like, what's the risk of if you instead went to the United Center and they could only get 4,000 butts in the seats and you got 10,000 empty seats? Like, what does that do? Does that doom the rest of your tour and your career forever?
No, I think then it makes it a much more comfortable concert to go to because you can just sit in the fifth row and make out with your wife and no one's even going to see you there.
Yeah, that would have been awkward with my sister. So so it was a good concert. She rocked. She played the guitar, she played the piano, she sang. Her band was fantastic. It was a great experience. So I came out of there.
Avril Lavigne, not your sister, right?
Right, Avril Lavigne.
Okay.
So I came out of the concert. I was like, man, that was really cool. I'm glad I did that. It was worth it. It's basically just spent 24 hours with my sister and then jumped back in the car and drove down to St. Louis just in time to take a shower and then grab my wife and go meet my friends to go out for dinner and then to Powell Hall in St. Louis for the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. So the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra was playing Symphony No. 2, Resurrection by Gustav Mahler, a German composer from the late 19th century. And this was like a 120-piece orchestra and then like 180 person choir. I mean, this was 300 world-class musicians. And this symphony was an hour and a half long, and I was riveted. It was really awesome. The acoustics were great. I'd never heard any of the music before. They did this fascinating thing I'd never even seen before, where my wife said she'd noticed, but I hadn't noticed. But about halfway through the performance, some of the musicians kind of snuck up out of their seats and disappeared. And then all of a sudden, the main orchestra would play a theme, and then like it was coming from a far off place, you would hear the theme again. And then I looked around. I was trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, and my friend points to the program where it said that some of the performers were performing off stage. They'd like gone into another room and they were playing along, but from another room. And there was like this back and forth between the orchestra and the orchestra that was like playing backstage, and they sounded like they were in a far off place. And it was so innovative and cool. It must have really been something back in the late 19th century.
That's cool. And I imagine it's good to see innovation in the symphony. Like, I don't know, is that a business or a genre? It can't be a very booming industry, so innovation is going to keep them alive, right?
Right. Avril Lavigne sold out the venue. The St. Louis Symphony Orchestra probably got about 2/3, I'd say, maybe 3/4 of the place.
Well, the last time I went to the symphony, it wasn't a symphony. It was at the Symphony Hall, and it was with, I think it was just the Phoenix Symphony, but they were playing, the only reason we went is they were playing all video game themes, and this one was specifically Zelda themed.
Yeah, I could get behind that.
So like the entire symphony, it was an hour and a half or 2 hours, and they played nothing but like the major themes from all the Zelda games back in the day.
That sounds great.
That one, yeah, it was. I was riveted to that one, but that's because I knew all the music and things, and it was. I mean, I can appreciate like being at a symphony, but I don't think I would go any other time.
So yeah, well, this is one of those things that like I was mildly curious because I'd never actually done it before, and Alicia wanted to really bad, and I want to invest in the friendship with my friends, and so it was just the perfect storm, and I went. And I wasn't disappointed. So if I had to say the two concerts on consecutive nights in identical venues, one, my expectations were pretty high and they were slightly not met, and then the other one, my expectations were pretty low and they were exceeded. And roughly, I'd say it came out equal. So I walked away from that going, in Chicago and St. Louis, the Symphony and the Rockstar, they were both pretty good. Like, I'd give them both the same score.
You're an odd person that would give the Rockstar and the Symphony the same score.
Yeah. Now,
but that's okay.
The economics of it baffles me. Like, here I have 304 world-class musicians, all playing their hearts out. And then a rock star, and a couple of roadies. And, guess who's getting more money?
Well, I mean, there's a lot that goes into that probably. And I'm sure it was more than a couple of roadies. There's probably, I could see like 100 people or so putting on a full blast concert like that. The profit split's going to be different. But, yeah. Is that a discussion we want to have? The economics of different musicians?
Not really. I'm ready to Forrest Gump that one.
My brother-in-law has his master's in performing arts. I'm going to see him this weekend, so I'll ask him some of these questions and see what life is like behind the curtain for symphony performers.
I would be interested to know about that. All right. So that brings us to our book club discussion.
Somehow.
Well, I got to pick the book this time. So the book is called Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. Now, something interesting had happened between the time the book came out and when I was like released in paperback, where they decided they had set their sights a little too low and they wanted to have a subtitle with a little more grandeur. So I ended up with a paperback copy of it, and the subtitle is The New Science of Having Less and How It Defines Our Lives.
Oof, they are really pushing that, aren't they?
So before we start to dig into the specifics of it, go ahead and give me your overall impression having read the book.
So I did listen to the book start to finish on audio, and I had not really high expectations for the book. It was going to be nonfiction. I was hoping that it was going to be very interesting, and overall, I'd say I was slightly disappointed. And that's because I assumed, and you said it was a book by a psychologist and an economist. And I had mentioned before that I tend to enjoy books by economists.
Yeah.
Because they're always very math-focused and very quantitative in their analysis and how they apply that to large-scale populations, with talking about standard deviations and repeating the experiment multiple times and that kind of thing. But this book definitely leaned way, way too hard on the psychologist side of it, where like the human brain is so complex and complicated that we can't really know how it works. Like it's too big of a system for us to identify how it works as a whole. So instead we have to identify tiny portions of very specific circumstances. And we use a bunch of those to try to draw a line to draw bigger conclusions about how the brain works. And I think they did a little too much of that in this book.
Okay. Yeah, I see how this could be a bit of a chore. I like reading about psychology, and I think one of the fundamental flaws of economics is that they assume that people are like Sims in a video game that behave predictably, and I don't think economics accounts enough for the fact that people are governed by psychology, and it's not predictable as they think it is.
Well, and that's the kind of the key difference between psychology and economics is the scale that you're looking at. A psychologist is interested in why one person makes decisions, whereas the economist is interested in why this population of tens of thousands make these large-scale decisions. Of course, there's always going to be outliers, but then you just plot them all on a graph, and we can see in the bell curve here, the 70% of people did this.
So the authors, Sendil Mulanthon, is a professor of economics at Harvard, and then Eldar Shafir is a professor of psychology at Princeton. So these are both Ivy League professors, at the kind of the peak of their powers. And you're right, they definitely had high ambitions. I think you could kind of see that in the vignette of them upgrading their subtitle to sound a bit more grandiose, that they really wanted to try to use psychology to have a better understanding of economics and vice versa.
I don't think economics is the right word for them. They keep trying to push that we need to base economic decisions off of their profound discoveries, which are not profound at all. But that's something we'll talk about, I think.
Okay, so I think that we need to introduce a little bit of vocabulary, and I don't think this will be as hard to engage in for our listeners if they haven't read the book. Because we're just going to talk about the ideas of it. You don't really have to have read the book, but it would be enlightening if you did.
Yeah, there aren't very many subtle plot points that you're going to miss by not reading the book and listening to us instead.
Okay, so there's three parts of the book. The first part is just understanding the mindset of scarcity. The second part is understanding the impact of it. And then the third part is once you understand the mindset and the impact, how you can use that to influence the world around you. Would you disagree with that?
No, that's a good summation of kind of the broad topics that they were talking about.
Okay,
yeah.
So let's introduce some of the terminology. So first, basically, the idea is that their main premise, and if you don't believe this premise, then the whole book falls apart. That is, if you are scarce of something, that it creates a psychology that's universal. So if you're scarce of food, as in hungry, or scarce of money, as in poor, or scarce of relationships, as in lonely, or scarce of time, as in busy. There's a couple of other types of scarcity they delve into, that there is a psychology that you experience that's the same. So you could think of a lonely person and a poor person having the same behavior, or a starving person and a busy person having the same behavior.
Right, like they're pointing out that it's, to be more general, I guess, is the idea of the resource management. If people need certain resources in their lives, and if you are low on a particular resource, it fires the same behaviors and tendencies in people, regardless of what that resource is.
Exactly. I can't help but imagine. Have you ever played any of the iterations of EA's The Sims?
I did back in the day, yes.
Yeah, I can't help but when I'm reading this, imagining like a little sim walking around with a meter over their head with how tired they are, how hungry they are, and how bad they've got to go to the bathroom.
Those are the only three you care about.
Right, and when the bathroom meter maxes out, then they start doing the potty dance, and they can't do anything else because they need to go to the bathroom. He didn't talk about that one in the book, but...
Yeah, but that tells you that their premise is, right there, the premise does make sense, that if you're so focused on going to the bathroom, then it's the same as if you're so focused on being hungry, or if you're so focused on being strapped for cash. Like people can see
you
that.
Can't think about anything else.
Yeah, and that feeds into some of the other things that they talked about that we need to define, I think, before we keep going.
Okay. Do you want to take them on?
Sure. I'm looking at my notes. I didn't take any of the vocab down, but I'm going to pull up your notes. I bet you wrote down all of the words.
I didn't, man. My notes are kind of poor. I was all over the place. But
okay. I'll pull them from my brain. Yeah, the biggest ones that he's talking about was the bandwidth tax. So they had some very ill-defined research that they did where, like, if you are preoccupied with something or you're scarce of a resource, that your cognitive ability in several measurable ways actually decreases. And they had a handful of experiments where they were discussing this, and like right away, I take issue with some of these things. Like they keep talking about the bandwidth tax, or if you're experiencing scarcity, and I keep wanting to correct them while they're talking in my head. Like you keep saying like they're scarce and they're experiencing scarcity. What you really mean is they're preoccupied. Yes, of course, if you're taking an IQ test, but before the IQ test starts, you're distracted by something that is very important to you, of course you're going to do worse in it.
So I want to clarify the terminology in a way that I think that makes this very easy to understand. He used two terms, I think, that describe two different sides of the same coin. One he called tunneling. Tunneling is when you're scarce of a resource, then you tend to focus on your need for that resource. And that means that almost like having blinders on, you're very zeroed in on the thing. If you're starving, you think about food.
Yeah, have you never heard the term tunnel vision?
Yes, exactly. Tunnel vision is a great
exactly
way to describe it. So that's one thing, and understanding that gives you a set of things to that you need to focus on, do. And then what you were talking about, bandwidth. To me, understanding here's the way I wrote it down. If tunneling is about the things at hand, bandwidth is about other stuff. So if like you're starving and you're focused on food, then you're reduced bandwidth, which means you aren't thinking as much about other things. So
right, and that is a good way of describing it.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the starving for a minute in terms of tunneling, because they talked about one of my favorite studies that I've seen come up over and over again. So back in World War II, towards the end of the war, as it became apparent that the Allies were going to win, they started to liberate, countries in Eastern Europe where people were under the Nazi regime or under Russian care and had been neglected so fully that they were on the brink of death because of starvation. They estimate more people died in World War II from starvation than from combat.
Yeah, that makes sense if you know the history of World War II and like what could possibly go wrong with mass bombings of economic centers.
Right. So, yeah, completely different discussion. So for the people that they were starting to liberate that were starving to death, they realized that they didn't have any relevant medical research that would allow them to have a rehabilitation plan for these people. So they were called back to the States, and some professors at the University of Minnesota gathered a bunch of volunteers who, as I understand, were either like conscientious objectors or were like the Steve Rogers of the world who didn't get the serum and were like couldn't go to combat but wanted to help out.
They make it sound like that. My inclination is that a lot of those could have been just people that were trying to get out of stuff through, just kind of the dregs.
So here's the thing, though, Josh. I read more about this study in other books, and I read about this study from some primary sources, and they started out with a really big group, but in order for it to work, they really had to whittle it down to people that were willing to voluntarily starve themselves to the brink of death.
Oh, well.
So
okay, then never mind. These are
committed people. They didn't lock them in a room and deprive them of food.
You just completely flipped my opinion of the people in the study. Yeah, they are true patriots then to subject themselves to starvation for a study.
Yes, it was done completely voluntarily. And basically the core of the study was 38 people. And the fascinating thing about this study, I mean, they figured out what they needed and established a vital core of research for an previously unknown area, but that's a complete different matter. However, they were so thorough in their research that they took a lot of notes, and some of the side effects of this study were that they had some psychological data for stuff that they didn't previously understand. And what they point out in the book is that the people that were part of this study found that they had their brains were preoccupied with the food in ways that weren't even logical.
Right, and they talk about some of the specifics, like they would go to the movies, and the people in the study wouldn't be able to tell you what the plot of the movie was, but they would be able to tell you exactly what every character ate throughout the movie.
Yes.
They talked about some of the participants started reading cookbooks like they were novels. Other ones started discussing the restaurants that they were going to open once they were done with the study and the war was over. It's just, kind of really weird side effects.
So this was an illustration of the idea of tunneling, that when they were scarce, that it almost gave them a superpower for food. It helped their brain focus on it. Now that's the benefit of scarcity. It gives you focus.
Right. And that's... So I don't know if that's... It's so nebulous to talk about these kinds of concepts because I feel like some of my objections are just kind of semantical for what they're talking about. But this specific portion of what they're talking about with scarcity, the tunneling, and you really focus on the thing, I feel like that is like built into us. Like that's hardwired into our brains from back in, Mesozoic era when we were tiny mammals fighting to survive on a planet that hated us. So, like, if the versions of us that didn't focus on food when we were hungry didn't eat and then died. And so the ones that were the most successful were the ones that, when they were hungry, they focused on food until they ate.
Right.
So it almost becomes a vital biological function that we, of course, if we're scarce of a resource, we're going to focus on it until we fulfill that need. That's like one of those genetic carryovers from back in the day.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, I noticed from your notes you were kind of like, yeah, duh. I mean, everybody knows this. When you're starving, you think about food a lot. But it's more than that. He said, there's a quote in here where he's kind of fighting that tendency to just dismiss his research as stating the obvious. He said, when we told an economist colleague that we were studying scarcity, he remarked, there's already a science of scarcity. You might have heard of it. It's called economics.
Yes, which is, and again, that's a little different from what they were trying to do. They were trying to do the individual person versus the large-scale communities, and I think we've talked about that a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, so, but we're just establishing the idea of that one of the things that scarcity does for you is it gives you focus, and he tends to call it tunneling. And tunneling is good when it helps you focus on something you need to do. And he would give an example, even a modern one, we're not like talking about starvation, but you're talking about like a college student who maybe sits down to write a paper that isn't due for 2 weeks, and they let themselves get distracted by an email or a YouTube video or something like that, and they don't get it done. But then it's the night before the paper's due, they sit down to write it, and they can filter out the distractions and the things and focus and get in the tunnel and achieve the objective.
So that is another thing that I take issue with in this book a lot, is that they have a lot of those examples, like to the point where they're using pure fiction anecdotes to prove their points. And yes, valid most of the time, their anecdotes are very applicable and they make sense logically, but that by no stretch of the imagination encompasses all the different people out there. Because you and I both know people that they'll sit down and focus and finish a deadline months ahead of time. then they just have that kind of self-discipline.
Okay, I like that you're bringing this up, because it's good to talk about these counterexamples, and does that actually mean that their research is invalid?
I'm not saying the research is invalid. What I take issue with is that they try to use the transitive property through these anecdotes to prove their point.
Sure.
They have these hard research, like actual data from an experiment that they did, and like with percentages, like this percentage of this people chose this, and this percentage of these people chose that. They use that in an anecdote that then points to their findings, and I almost feel like, well, I mean, I could come up with a different anecdote that completely explains the basis of this study without pointing to scarcity. Like, you don't get to A equals B, therefore B equals C. Like, you don't get to do that here.
In their I see what you're saying, and in their defense, if that's all this book was, it wouldn't be worthy of 2 Ivy League professors. But that isn't all they did. You know, they provided those anecdotes to make it readable, and then they did experimental research. And there was a lot of experimental research in this book. I mean, there was lab stuff they did back at the university, but then they did a lot of work forward in India, and that's something else I wanted to talk about. Okay. So tunneling is focusing on the thing, and then the cost of that is that things outside the tunnel you ignore, or you also have a reduction in bandwidth, which is things outside the tunnel that you no longer have the ability to focus on, and that causes problems in your life. I mean, we could look at some examples, but one of my favorites that they did was the study where they were talking about they went to... Okay.
I can hear you flipping through the paperback.
Yeah. All right. The first one I want to talk about is basically, okay, so if you understand that scarcity causes you to tunnel and that it reduces your bandwidth, then that can help you make better decisions about how to help people with things. And one of their biggest premises was to try to fight the idea that people are poor because they're dumb.
So I totally agree with this premise. Is that and that's kind of the way that we design training, and the differences between what's effective and what a committee thinks will be effective when it comes to training. And they do make a lot of excellent points that a lot of people that are really tight financially have problems like attending set regular financial classes because of their irregular work schedules or childcare problems, or it's really hard sometimes for people to adhere to what would be considered a normal regimented thing. And at the same time, like the kind of training that we're trying to offer people, the kind of training that comes down from on high, like, oh, well, this is information that they need. So how do we most efficiently convey this information? It always turns into like a PowerPoint slide deck and a lecture. And that's not going to be effective. Like people, these trainings need to be designed differently. And I do agree with that premise.
So one of the ways he was talking about that is that frequently that kind of training falls outside the tunnel. Like if you get a bunch of poor people and you put them in a room and you give them a PowerPoint, they're not going to listen. But it's not because they're not smart enough to understand it, which might be some people's estimation of them, but it's because being poor makes them not able to focus on it, and the only way you can get to them is by putting it in a way that they can focus on it.
Well, and they oversimplify it a little bit, and I think you and I have a better understanding of how training for mass groups of people can go wrong really quickly because we've been subjected to so much of it in our careers in the Air Force. But one of the examples that they used that I really did like was they were talking about a lot of self-employed merchants. It was either in India or in the Caribbean, like very, very low income, like living on $2 a day kind of thing. And there was a local organization that was trying to help them with their financial situations, and by teaching them, giving them basic financial education on this is how you run a business, this is how you keep track of your money, this is how you do your profit and losses and that kind of stuff. And like when they analyzed the kind of training that they were trying to give to these tiny small business owners that were just living day to day, hand to mouth, it was like 40 hours of computer-based training.
Right, they were
about
like teaching them how to do like advanced bookkeeping.
Yeah, exactly. And then they talked about, but then they redesigned the course and they switched it to like the tips and tricks that the most successful like tiny business owners used. It was a lot more relevant and pertinent. And again, that just goes back to, well, yeah, duh. You can't you can't take guys making $2 a day and expect them to understand the value of having clean books for a financial institution. versus how to best like keep your money separate. You know what I mean?
Right. And some of it was more than that. Like he gave the example of corn farmers in Africa that showed that utilizing fertilizer would increase their yield by 75%. And yet the fact that they could only afford the fertilizer like right after the harvest, but they didn't need it until right before they planted, made it so that the people didn't do it as much as it would make sense to do it. And it's not because they're dumb. It's because of the scarcity of being poor.
Well, it's because of the fact that as farmers, they would see a big surge in income right at harvest time, and then the time when they needed to do the fertilizing was well past that time when they weren't so flush with cash. And so, like, their whole life, they were just taking care of the crocodile closest to the canoe, Ben.
Yes! Ha ha! So...
Oh, it finally happened.
One of the things that they said was this study that they did in Chennai, India. And I love this. When I read this the first time, I was so fascinated by the idea that they decided to do an experimental study. And it was so cheap and yet so interesting. All right, I'll read a bit of it. It says... basically, they picked out a bunch of street vendors, a whole bunch of them. And the basic life of a street vendor in like overpopulated India is that they'll wake up at like the butt crack of dawn, go to some like loan shark, borrow $2 worth of merchandise at 50%, like a huge interest rate, go spend their entire day selling it, get by just barely enough to live, and then give half of that back to the street vendor to pay interest on their day's work. And so what they decided to do was they thought, how much would it change these people's lives if instead of borrowing that $2 a day they needed to buy their merchandise and pay half of their profits back in interest, if we just gave them the $2, then all of their profits they made that day they would have as income. And
right. And I also enjoyed this study because it pointed to what I think is more insightful. One of their discoveries, but go ahead.
So they basically picked a control group where they just monitored what they did and didn't do anything different. And then they picked another group and said, here's the money so you can buy your goods for the day that you're going to sell at the market. And amongst the, what they say, 2,500 people that they looked at, 65% of them borrowed this money every day. And of the experimental group that they gave this to, by the end of the experiment, most of them had already gone back into borrowing every day, like they'd consumed it. So this goes into another vocabulary term we hadn't introduced yet that they talk about, and that is slack.
Yeah, slack and shocks.
And shocks.
Yes, which makes a lot of sense. So the slack is kind of your savings or your disposable income. If we're talking about financially versus if we're talking about food, I guess your slack would be the food in your pantry. It's the ability to absorb unexpected expenses that crop up in your life. So, and that's another study they do in America where they said something, and I've heard this study before. It's something like more than half the population wouldn't be able to afford a $2,000 bill if it hit them out of nowhere.
Right.
It's because they don't have any slack. They don't have any savings. They're not planning for that. They're living too close to the edge. And the shocks are the things that pop up that you're not expecting, like the unexpected bill. Like for a farmer, I guess it would be a flash flood or bad weather that wipes out a harvest or a crop or something.
Yeah. And so I realized this because there was something in my life that I'd kind of worried about that I felt like I was wrong about, and I realized that I was actually doing it on purpose, and this gave me the terminology to describe it. So when I was growing up, there were times in my life where we were well below the poverty line, and it affected me. And so as I got through the period of my life where we were a young family, just out of college and student loans and kind of scraping by and stuff, I was very much, like he said, in the tunnel. If you stop a poor person and they're coming out of the grocery store and you ask them how much they paid for something, they know how much they paid for everything. But right now, if you stop me when I'm coming out of the grocery store and ask me how much I paid for the stuff, I might not be able to tell you.
So I found that part of it interesting too, because they said far and away anybody that has decent income or good income, they would ask these questions like, how much did you pay for any particular item in their cart as they're coming out of the grocery store? And the vast majority weren't able to say anything about it.
Can you?
And actually, for a lot of the things that go into my grocery cart, yes, I can. I think part of that is just I have a good memory. And the second thing is, I do most of the grocery shopping for our family. And it was probably a couple of years ago I started paying attention because I noticed that on the price tags in the grocery store, they have the little per ounce numbers.
Yes, I pay attention
and
to those.
Oh yeah, I got super into, well, hang on a second. Let's look at the economy of bulk here.
Yeah.
Because I recently, one of my favorite examples, and my family is going to kill me for saying this on the podcast because I've probably said this to them 100 times in the last 2 months. My family goes through a lot of eggs now because we eat fried eggs in the morning for breakfast. We're doing, I think, 8 eggs a day between the 4 of us. And so I switched from buying a dozen eggs, 2 dozen eggs in 2 separate cartons at a time, to buying 1 carton of 5 dozen eggs at a time. And the cost savings is staggering. Like each dozen eggs in its own little dozen carton is something like $2. But if you buy 5 dozen eggs, it's only like $2.80.
Wow.
Yeah, so you get more than twice of the volume.
What's the per egg cost?
Yeah, exactly. The per egg cost is way cheaper if you buy 5 dozen. But I always get weird looks coming out of the normal grocery store with, like a little thing of like coffee, ground up coffee, and then like a couple of the frozen meals that I eat for lunch, and then 5 dozen eggs.
Here's what I didn't realize that this gave me the ability to understand. I didn't realize that I was purchasing a luxury by not having to do this. Now, I do pay attention to things like unit costs and stuff like that, but I don't like buy generic brand or clip coupons or anything like that, because what I'm doing is I'm utilizing the slack that I have, where I have a comfortable enough income that I don't have to pay attention to what the cost of those things is, and then I don't have to devote any of my bandwidth to that.
Right, and that's a deliberate trade-off that you're making, because when you don't have the money, you have time, or you don't really have time, I guess. But you're trading the money that you would have spent not caring about the specific prices or the brands that you're purchasing, and you're trading it for the time it takes to analyze and find the best deal.
Not just the time, but like the consumption of your mental resources and your emotions. And he kind of gives a few vignettes about how poor people that are just so focused on having to do this stuff all the time, then it makes them make bad decisions in other parts of their life because their bandwidth is reduced.
Yeah, that's part of the thing that I don't really like. Again, they go anecdotally. A lot of anecdotes about possible bad parenting scenarios.
I've seen this so much in my life, though.
I know. I have too, but at the same time, like you're not allowed to just equate the two.
You're right.
Just because you're focused and you're tunnel visioned on something else, that doesn't make you a bad parent.
In the intro, though, they're like, we understand, that we're taking this anecdotic style. They don't name him on purpose, but people like, Michael Levitt and Michael, the other Michael that wrote Freakonomics, and Malcolm Gladwell and authors like that have kind of popularized this engaging story-based style for understanding economics, have kind of made it less scientific of a discipline, but also a lot more engaging.
And I get that. I just don't. Yeah, I just don't respond well to it, I guess, or I didn't in this specific scenario, just because it's. I don't know. There were so many times I was listening to the book, and I'm just like, dude, you can't equate that. Like you're skipping and you're glossing over way too many variables to try to draw a straight line from here to here.
Well, good on you for your scientific discipline, because most of the time I was just on board, and I'm like, yeah, tell me more, professor.
Well, actually, I think this speaks more to our personality traits than anything else. Like, your personality is just very receptive and engaging and positive. Like, yes, this all makes sense, and I can equate this to things that I do. And I'm just a naysayer. Like, even in this podcast, whenever you say something, like, no, Ben, I don't think you're right.
That's good, though. That makes for an interesting discussion and a thorough exploration of the ideas. So I'm going to tell you a story that happened in my own life, and I want you to tell me which one of the concepts in the book it's an example of. So,
oh, wow. I didn't know there was going to be a quiz.
Yeah, it's a quiz. So we were in England, and my in-laws came to visit, and my father-in-law is like a huge golfer, and he wanted to make a pilgrimage to St. Andrews in Scotland, which was like 6 hours north. So we piled all the kids in the van, drove up to Scotland, rented, this beautiful little chalet on an old, it looked like something right out of an episode of that British drama. I can't remember the name of it, that just came out as a movie.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and now the fact that you can't remember the name means I can't remember the name.
I must have too much bandwidth spent on other things. Downton Abbey. It looked like right out of Downton Abbey. It was beautiful. We had a lovely time in Scotland. Anyway, we drove back. I think we stayed up there 1 or 2 nights, and then we drove back to our house in England, 6 hours south, and we were sitting at dinner. I can't remember if my in-laws had already left, but there's a knock at the door. My son goes and answers the door, and he comes back to the dinner table. And he's like, "Dad, the police are at the door." I'm like, "What?" He's like, "Yeah, the police."
What?
I'm like, I've never talked to the police the whole time I've been in England. I didn't have any reason to. So I went to the door. I'm like, "What can I do for you, officer?" Because I didn't know what to call him. And he was like, "Were you in Scotland yesterday?" I'm like, "Yeah, why?" It's kind of far away, but man, I gotta give these guys props for efficiency. He's like, "Yeah, we need to talk. Why don't you step outside?" I was like, "Okay." So I stepped outside, and he basically told me a story about how we'd pulled over at a highway rest stop, and we'd gotten out, pumped the car full of gas. All the kids had piled out of the car. We went into the gas station. I think we bought some treats. I took some kids to the bathroom. I gathered up some other kids, and we ended up and loaded back up in the car and left without paying for the gas.
Ooh, you stole a tank of gas.
I was wanted in Scotland.
Oh, that's hilarious. Like, how much did the gas end up costing?
It was like $50 worth of gas. I don't know, whatever that is in pounds. And
okay, then how much did it cost for bail? And then how much did it cost to get a public defender?
So he cuffed me and took me to jail. No, that didn't happen. So anyway, so that
man, you know what? You just all right. I'm sorry. I got to put your story on pause. Like, you just painted the best picture of England like I've ever heard of, because like crime in England is so low that the cops have time to track down a guy who stole a tank of gas within 24 hours of the event.
Yeah, I was astonished at how efficient they were.
Aren't there any like murders you guys should be investigating?
Apparently not. So they got time, and when I came to the door, I think his blood pressure went down immensely. You know, he knew he was in a nice neighborhood, and it wasn't on purpose. And he said he talked to the staff at the gas station. They seen the video, and he was like, "It was obvious you and your wife were both so busy with the kids that you both thought the other one was paying for the gas, and neither of you did." And in England, they don't have pay at the pump, so this is a great example of the concept in this book where my bandwidth was just, I was in the tunnel and I missed something that was outside the tunnel and just missed it. Like, I didn't even know I'd missed it. I wasn't intending to steal a tank of gas. Anyway, I contacted the gas station and paid for the gas, and everything was fine. There was no charges pressed or anything. At least I don't think so. Maybe if I ever try to get a visa to go back to England and I find out there's a warrant for my arrest.
Well, apparently you're public enemy number 4 or something in Scotland.
It's serious. Don't steal a tank of gas. They will find you.
Oh, man.
So
I have to tell you, my favorite part of that last little bit that we were just talking about is the idea that there's going to be some listeners somewhere screaming at their headset, "Downton Abbey. It's Downton Abbey, you fools. It's Downton Abbey."
You're so right. They are. Okay, another story about a different concept. So that was an example of tunneling. My wife and I were so tunneled on the travel and the kids and stuff that we forgot to pay for the gas. And that's an example of the kind of things that happen with the poor. You don't have any slack. You're focused on meeting everything, and you like bounce a check or something, and then you get a bounce check fee, which is humongous, and then you're late on your payment, and then you get an overage fee and stuff like that, and you get caught in what they call in the book the scarcity trap, where you just
this death spiral that just goes down and down.
Yeah, and I know they gave some anecdotal evidence, but they also gave some research evidence. I don't think there's any disagreement that there is a scarcity trap that exists.
All right, and one of the things that I did want to bring up while we're talking about the tunnel vision and the scarcity trap and how it causes big problems is this is actually not new information to the Air Force. So I spent a chunk of my career as a pilot, and I had to go through pilot training, and they talked a lot about not getting tunnel vision and actively monitoring yourself and your crew for tunnel vision problems. And one of the best examples they gave that was, like, frankly startling was that 25% of all the major incidents that have happened, like all the major crashes, anything that led to loss of life or more than $2 million in damaged property or airplanes or whatever, 25% of them from 1993 to 2002 were caused by this phenomenon called CFIT, CFIT, which is controlled flight into terrain. The plane didn't crash. The plane was completely under control. There was no problems mechanically or anything with the airplane. The pilot calmly and collectedly flew it into the ground or into a mountain or something.
25%?
25% of all the worst accidents in the Air Force for a decade were caused by tunnel vision, by some uncommon thing happening, and then the entire crew focusing on it, and to the exclusion of everything else until they were all killed.
Yes, and they talked about an example of this in the book. They talked about wheels up crashes in the World War II era, where basically the pilot would land on the ground and then try to retract the flaps, but instead of retracting the flaps, he'd retract the landing gear.
And that's a thing that the Air Force is aware of. That's called human factors. At the Air Force Academy, they had an entire major, like you could study just that and get a degree in human factors of operational research.
Sure, and that's controlled flight into terrain, but after you're already on the ground, so less damage.
That's like, stop thinking about getting to the O Club and drinking your first beer and make sure your fingers are on the right switch.
Well, and I love the way you illustrated that just now, because that's kind of a callous way, and that shows very much the Air Force mindset. Like, oh, if you weren't so distracted about thinking about something you shouldn't be, you would have done your job properly. But I don't think most of the time when people make these kinds of mistakes, that's not what it is. And that's the way they approach it in the book. They said they studied this problem, and instead of just looking at it as if it was poor execution by the part of somebody who was dumb, they looked at like, all right, did we give them too hard of a problem to do at a time when they're already so taxed that their bandwidth has been reduced to the point where a simple mistake could be an expensive one or a dangerous one. And so they looked at the cockpit of these two aircraft, the B-17 and the B-25, where they were having all these wheels-up crashes, and they found out that whoever designed the cockpit put the lever for retracting the flaps right next to the lever for retracting the landing gear, and they looked exactly the same.
Right. Presumably they were labeled differently, but yeah. So if you're going to reach down without looking, it's clear that it's definitely possible to grab the wrong lever. And then, of course, the most elegant solution was not more training, was not more like yelling at the crew.
Yes.
It was the guy that they had hired to do the study put a big rubber knob on the end of the landing gear lever that made it feel like a little wheel. And I thought that part of the book was hilarious because they still do that to this day. When I flew, every single landing gear switch that I have ever seen throughout training has a big like rubber wheel on it. So like there is no mistaking this is the landing gear.
Yeah,
lever.
And how much does that rubber wheel cost? 50 cents?
For the government, probably close to $3,000.
Yeah. Okay. Let's say it costs $10,000. let's say it costs 500 shares of Office Depot. Then it still is more economical than one single wheels up crash. You know, and
this is true.
All the extra PowerPoints and ancillary training in the world is not, that you think is going to tell your pilots enough times that they never forget to not put the wrong lever isn't as effective as just putting a stupid rubber thing on it.
Which goes back to the discussion we were having before, where there are certain situations that you need to look at from a different perspective. Instead of maybe blaming the victim of these circumstances and trying to shove a square peg into a round hole, maybe you should look back at how you're administering this training or trying to convey this information and do it in a way that is more easily received and maybe more pertinent to the person in the scenario in the first place.
Exactly. Sometimes the systems create perverse incentives. Like they gave the example of when, I don't remember, it was like early 19th century, they started to find a bunch of dinosaur bones in China. And they were like, "Oh man, let's enlist the local populace to help excavate these dinosaur bones, and in order to help them contribute faster, we'll pay them per bone." And you remember what they did?
Yes, and it's the perfectly logical thing that of course you would do. If you, dear listener, were given this opportunity where if you found a thing and you turned in the thing, you would get money for that thing, what would you do? And the Chinese peasants did exactly what any logical thinking person would. They took hammers and they smashed the bones that they found into multiple fragments so they could turn in the individual fragments.
What a perverse outcome that is. And of course...
But that is a great example of a completely different thing that I want to talk about at some point, is that people see these failures in the world, and they're not failures of what... The failure is not the situation. The failure is in the mechanics and the rules that you defined for that situation.
Right. That system was set up to get Chinese peasants to smash dinosaur bones into little pieces.
Exactly. And that's one thing about this book. They talked a lot about the poor and how we do a bad job at administering help
Yes.
and training to the poor, but not at any one time did they talk about like the weird government incentive program that kind of locks people into that cycle.
They kind of did a little. They talked about like limits for how long you can remain on government welfare and stuff like that.
They touched on it, but that's a much deeper concept that has long-reaching ramifications. And I felt like they were going to dive into a big discussion about it, but it's clear they didn't want to get that political about it. So, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I feel like they missed an opportunity because I was just hoping they would talk about something a little more interesting to me.
Yeah,
but
you could tell that they were both very motivated by the cause of providing a different way of thinking about poverty and ways to approach public policy that can have effective outcomes on helping people who are trapped in the scarcity cycle.
And you say that statement in a vacuum and everybody will agree with you. And then you start talking specifics and everybody starts yelling at each other.
Well, I like in the end when they start to get into solutions. So like, okay, so we've given you all these ideas about tunneling and bandwidth and the scarcity trap and the focus dividend and tunnel vision, all those kinds of things. Now that you understand all of this, how can we use this to do things? So part 3 of the book was like the solutions and ideas that you could use. And this is where I found like it wasn't developed, but it was more challenging us to come up with those things than it was. Like, okay, we've given you a new way of thinking. Now you come up with ways to utilize it. And they gave some good examples. Like, for instance, they talked about how trying to do things like dieting that require you to make a good decision over and over and over again are very taxing on your bandwidth. But if there's a way for you to make a good decision relating to that a one-time decision can have repeated impact, then when you're a moment of high bandwidth and you feel motivated to make the decision, then do it. Like they gave the example of programs that were designed to encourage people to save, where if you gave them the option to opt into the program, only 45% of people would opt into the program to save more. But if you gave them the opt-out option, 80% of people would. And that's
right,
that's a good example.
People are inherently, you're using your laziness to your own benefit there.
Yeah, right. Like buying a gym membership, although that's not going to make you use it.
I was going to bring that up as the perfect counterexample because gym memberships would fail if they didn't rely on the fact that people will make decisions in isolation. At one point, it's like, I'm going to get in shape and I'm going to go to the gym. And they make the dedication and you have to sign up for a certain amount of time and there's money down and you do all of that. And then after that, it doesn't matter if you go or not. You've already paid and the gym gets to continue operating. Like, I feel like every gym I've ever been to, if like even 30% of the members all showed up at the same time, the place would be packed wall to wall.
Yeah. All right. So when I'm listening to this, I think, I'm not going to have too many options in the near future to solve world poverty, but I can use these ideas in my own life. And this is the part that fascinates me. Like back in 2004, when I was deciding to get into the Air Force, I had a problem I was having in my own life. I was teaching 6th, 7th, and 8th grade computers, and every day I would go in the morning with like a full tank, having recharged from eating and sleeping and spending some time with my family. And then during the course of the day, a bunch of rambunctious teenagers would consume my patience that was a finite resource, and I would get home and I wouldn't have any patience left for my children. As much as I loved them, as much as I wished that I could, I had consumed all of that finite resource. I had no bandwidth left to be a good parent to my children. And I thought, I got to find another line of work because being a school teacher makes me a bad father.
I'm trying to imagine what Ben Rich imagines being a bad father is, and the only thing I can come up with is like, oh man, I said crap in front of my kids.
So I know you didn't like the imaginary vignettes, but they gave a great example where they talked about a busy executive who like thought he was too busy to go to his daughter's baseball game. Do you remember this one?
I do remember that vignette. I remember like despising it when they were talking about it.
Well, I'm going to repeat it anyway.
Okay.
So he gives the example of this busy executive who's like, I got a project I'm working on work. I'm too busy to go to my daughter's softball game, but I'm going to go anyway. And he does go anyway, but because he's distracted and thinking about work and stuff, he isn't really there. And when she asks him for some help, he gets impatient with her and snaps at her, and it kind of ruins the evening. And that's what it was like. Because good dad Ben goes to his kid's baseball game, is engaged in the game, smiles at the kids, laughs, and they have a fun time and make a good memory. Bad dad Ben goes to the same game, but is impatient, maybe snaps at the kid and turns it into a sour evening and a bad memory.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason I really hated that vignette is because that's something that does happen to people. And you want to be better than that, you know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
you want to feel like, at least I want to feel like that I have more control over myself than that, but I know I've done it. So it just irritates me to have it thrown back in my face, I guess.
Okay, that's a good reason to be sour at anecdote, hitting a little too close to home. So
It's like, oh, stupid book calling me a bad parent, even though I am. Screw you, book.
So I don't know if you saw on my notes page, but I put in there a pie chart that I made back in 2011. And this...
I'm sorry, you made a pie chart in 2011? That shocks me.
Yeah, so in 2011, I made this pie chart because I had deployed to Afghanistan for 9 months. And while I was over there, I was able to accomplish some personal goals that I hadn't been able to in the previous 3 years that I've been trying to do. I had some studying I needed to do. I got a major industry technical certification. I lost 20 pounds. I improved my fitness test scores significantly, and I was just really effective at work. And so I was trying to figure out, these are all things I wanted to do. What's so different about my life at home versus my life in the war zone? Why I can accomplish these personal things that I wanted to do at home, and I couldn't do them at home, but I can in the war zone.
Can I go ahead before we dig into the pie charts? Can I postulate what I think is the answer? Because I deployed as well and experienced the same phenomenon.
Okay.
Right. The idea is that when you're deployed, there's a lot of overhead in your life that goes away that you didn't realize was overhead. So like every minute that you spent driving anywhere is now time that's given back to you. All of the time that you spent watching TV no longer exists because there is no TV. So you have to fill it with something else. All the time that you spent prepping any meal goes away because you don't prep your own meals. Like, there's just all of these nickels and dimes that get taken from you throughout the day for the various necessary things that have to happen are already taken care of as part of the bigger system of keeping people there. And you get all that time back. And when you, in isolation, each one of those things isn't that much time. But when you get it all in lump sum like that, like, it's just, what do you mean? I have all this time and you can just accomplish all of these goals.
Say what you just said in the vocabulary of the book.
So, like, you're experiencing time scarcity when you're at home, and then you are given, when you go down range to deploy, you are given a ton of time slack. And so that slack allows you to then get out of the tunnel, which then gives you more of your cognitive bandwidth that you need in order to focus on larger, broader goals, and then you improve yourself as a person.
Okay. Yeah. So
no, that was pretty good for spur of the
not
moment.
bad. Professor Sendel, if you're listening, Josh is happy to come to Harvard. So
that was a very high school teacher moment. Don't ever do that to me again.
I could only hope. Did you look at my pie chart yet?
I am looking at your pie chart now. Yes.
Because what?
There's so let me describe it for the listeners.
Go ahead.
Ben
I'll put it in
has
the show notes.
Excellent. He has two pie charts that are next to each other, and it's not labeled well, but I'm assuming this is a breakdown of the time that you spent. Is it waking time only?
No, it's all
there's
time.
sleep. You're right. You have sleep on there too, which is interesting. And he's broken it out by percentage that he's spent in some major categories of how you would spend your time. Like, there's sleep, there's work. The next biggest one is like entertainment for when you're home, and then family is a big one here. Oh, family is bigger than entertainment by 1%. Sorry, I got those mixed up. There's fitness and walking and a bunch of other things. So it's this color-coded pie chart breaking down Ben's life.
Yes. So what I was basically trying to figure out is, and what I didn't know because I hadn't read this book yet, is why do I feel like I have so much more bandwidth when I'm deployed, even though I'm spending so much more time working?
It looks like because you got significantly more sleep.
Right? Okay, so when I'm deployed, I get more sleep. That's one. And that can't be discounted, and they talk about that in the book.
Yep.
I also spent more time doing fitness, more time writing, it's the same amount of time eating. That was the only thing I spent the same amount of time doing. But I got more sleep. I did more work, but then you notice the family piece of the pie is gone, and the chores piece of the pie goes down from 8% to 1%. So I'm not cleaning up after people. I'm not fixing things. I'm not taking care of stuff. And all that time I converted into like productive time, probably because I was getting enough sleep.
What's really interesting about this is the difference between the sleep from when you were deployed versus when you were at home is equal to the amount of chores that you do at home.
Is that just a 1-for-1 swap?
Yes, just like, oh, well, we don't have time for chores, so I guess I'm just not going to sleep now.
Yeah. I created this meme of Wesley from Princess Bride saying, "Life is chores, Highness." Because that's what it feels like sometimes as a parent. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my son always asks me, he's like, "Hey, can we go do something and play?" And I always have to like put something down and be like, "Do you see what I'm doing right now?"
Yes.
What am I doing?
Yeah.
Oh, you're doing the dishes, you're doing the laundry, you're cleaning something. I'm like, yeah, I am fighting the constant entropy that you have introduced into my life. So we will play together and I will hang out with you, but just not right this second.
Yeah. So I think I can kind of wrap it up as far as the scarcity discussion with why this appeals to me so much. This idea that understanding how something that feels isolated, as in being, trying to diet or trying to write something or finish a project or get something done, all relates to this common mindset. And if you understand the mindset, you can kind of try to shortcut it if you need to. And there, you've had false attempts at this in your life, I'm sure. Have you ever tried to if you find you're late all the time, you can just fix it by setting your clock ahead? But that doesn't work because you set your clock ahead. The same as if you find you're really effective at writing a paper the night before it's due, but you can't be that same degree of effective 2 weeks early, even if you pretend it's due the next day. Some things you can't synthesize, but some you can. And by understanding that, you can try to attack the problem. I don't fully know the answer to it. I don't know how to lose that weight I need to lose. I don't know how to get to the gym more. I don't have the solutions to all these problems, but I feel like studying this helps me better figure out how to attack it.
Well, and that's, I think the fundamental thing that we're talking about is in the tunnel, or if you're out of the tunnel, how to focus on the things that you want to do. When you're tunneling on something, it's because there's that part of your brain, that animal part of your brain is kicking in and you're realizing that you're running out of a resource, and that allows you to focus on it because that's that built-in hardwired effect. When you're not in the tunnel and you have an abundance of the resource, but you still want to be able to focus and get the benefits of it, it becomes a purely cognitive exercise. It has to be, they called it executive control. That is you telling yourself and willing it and making it happen to actually sit down and focus and do the paper. Which, that's a scarce resource in of itself. The willpower to sit and focus and do the things that you want to do.
Did you have any things like that you were kind of thinking as you were reading this?
Oh, absolutely. I would have failed out of a normal civilian college. If I hadn't gone to the Air Force Academy and had every second of my life completely structured from an outside authority figure that I recognized, I'd have failed out in no time. I'd have gotten super lazy, skipped classes, relied too hard on my memory, and just started failing.
Wow. That's something you and I had in common. That's part of the reason I went into the military. It wasn't just to get out of teaching because it was making me a bad father. It was also because I desired to have kind of a line of work and a way of life that had a bit more structure so that I could have that, what you just described.
Well, I'm going to put, you mind if I put my notes of the book on here real quick?
Yeah.
Like you summed it up, how it meant to you. I'm going to let it, what it meant to me.
Go ahead.
So, I think you can kind of tell my impressions of the book are mixed. There are a lot of the topics they talk about that I agree with. There are some that I take issue with, and not necessarily what they're saying, but how they're trying to draw their conclusions. It was worth reading, if for no other reason than it makes me think about this in a little different way than I had previously. And I guess my bottom line of this whole thing is I was hoping it was going to be more math and less anecdote.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Well done. Okay, so kind of wrap things up. There's a couple of housekeeping things I want to do. First of all, I'm starting to set up a social media presence, and I've got a Facebook page. So if you go to the Bad at Magic podcast Facebook page, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. And if you want to just navigate to it on Facebook, give us a like. We'd appreciate it. And if you heard us talking about something in the show and you're interested and you want to engage on a discussion with it with other people, because I found that as I talk to people that listen to the podcast, they're like, I want to talk about something you guys talked about. Great. This will give you a place you can do it and engage with other people who maybe would love to hear your ideas. I certainly would. So go check out our Facebook page. And also my sister Jonica, I want to thank for making our awesome new logo for the podcast.
Our logo is very awesome, and I do thank her for me the next time that you see her.
Yes.
And can I point out the inside joke with the logo?
Sure, go ahead.
Awesome. Like any good podcast, our logo is an inside joke because the color scheme is based off of the Nike Air Max 1995 Neon Green Edition that Ben has owned dozens of pairs of.
Yes, it's awesome. I love the logo. Thank you, Jonica. Okay. I think for next time, I didn't have any big ones, although I know you've got some events coming up. But I think maybe next time we can have a discussion about the player psychographics and get into those a little bit more detail. I don't.
Oh, okay.
Other than that, I don't see any big homework for next time, unless you see something coming up you're interested in talking about.
Not really. I think all of our conversations are interesting, if for no other reason than we have a very loose, generic outline of topics we want to discuss, and then invariably it'll go spinning off about how you're some kind of oil thief in Scotland.
I can't go back there.
Never again.